At 18:20 hours on August 12, 1944, a bomber came apart in the sky over Suffolk, England. There was no wreck to find. 10 tons of explosive went off at 2,000 feet, and the aircraft simply stopped existing. People miles away felt the ground move under them. The pilot was 29 years old. His name was Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr., and he was the eldest son of one of the most powerful families in America. He had already finished his tour. He was cleared to go home. What he volunteered for instead was never meant to be spoken about, and his family would carry the answer for the rest of their lives. Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr. was born on July 25, 1915, in Hull, Massachusetts. He was the first of 9 children born to Joseph and Rose Kennedy, and from the beginning he was the one the family measured itself against. He was bigger than his brothers, louder, better at everything that could be scored. At Harvard he played football. In London, where his father served as ambassador to Britain, he was the son introduced first. The plan was not a secret inside that house. Joe Jr. would enter Congress, then the Senate, and then he would be President of the United States. His father said it out loud. To understand why a man with a guaranteed future climbed into a flying bomb, you have to understand what he was competing against, and it was not the Germans. At 25, he had already sat as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. In 1941, Joe Jr. left Harvard Law School and enlisted in the Navy. He did not take a desk job. He chose flight training, and he earned his wings of gold at Jacksonville, Florida, in May 1942. His younger brother John, thin and sick for most of his childhood, had already been turned down by the Army. Both Kennedy sons were now at war. Only one had been promised the future. Kennedy could have flown almost anything he wanted. He chose one of the least glamorous jobs in all of naval aviation. He went first to Patrol Squadron 203 and then to Bombing Squadron 110, flying the Liberator, the 4-engine bomber the Navy used to hunt submarines. He commanded a crew of 10. In September 1943, he crossed to England. His base was Dunkswell in Devon, a freezing, permanently wet airfield, the American crews nicknamed Mudville Heights. The work was long and dangerous in a way that never made the papers. If anyone in your family flew out of Dunkswell, put their name in the comments now. Almost nobody remembers that place. The patrols ran 12 hours and longer. Bombing Squadron 110 flew out over the Bay of Biscay hunting German submarines as they moved between their concrete pens on the French coast and the Atlantic convoy lanes. Most flights found nothing but gray water. The real danger was weather, fuel, mechanical failure, and the long odds of one aircraft alone over open sea. Men in the squadron died without ever seeing an enemy. Kennedy flew through the winter of 1943 and into the spring, and by that summer he had completed 25 combat missions. That was a full tour. He had earned his ticket home. He did not take it. Kennedy volunteered for a second set of missions, 10 more of them, and then he stayed on past those as well. On July 1, 1944, he was promoted to lieutenant. By then, the invasion had come and gone. American and British armies were grinding through the hedgerows of Normandy, and for the first time the war in Europe had a visible end to it. Every man in the squadron who had finished his tour was going home to America, to families who had been counting the missions from a kitchen table. Kennedy wrote home that he was staying a little longer. He did not say what for because he did not yet know himself. There was one more thing pulling at him, and it had happened a year earlier on the other side of the world. On August 2, 1943, a Japanese destroyer cut an American patrol torpedo boat in half in Blackett Strait in the Solomon Islands. The boat was PT-109. Its commander swam for hours through open water, towing a badly burned crewman by a life jacket strap held in his teeth, and he got his surviving men onto an island. His name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was the younger brother. He was the sick one. He was not the plan. And that autumn, every newspaper in America printed his name on the front page. The newspapers made John Kennedy a hero. The story ran across the country. The Navy awarded him the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, and Joseph Kennedy Sr. made certain that every man he knew had read about it. Then, at a dinner in Hyannis Port, a guest stood and raised a glass to the father of a hero. The hero was not Joe. Sit in that chair for a moment. You are 28 years old. You have been the one who goes first your entire life, and the room is toasting your younger brother. I genuinely do not know what I would have done with that. He congratulated his brother warmly in front of everyone, and then he went upstairs alone. Then, in the summer of 1944, the war handed him a target. On June 13th, 1 week after the Normandy landings, the first German V-1 flying bomb fell on London. They came day and night after that, hundreds every week, and there was no warning except the sound of the engine cutting out overhead. Before the campaign ended, more than 6,000 people in Britain would be killed by them. Allied intelligence knew the launch ramps were only the start of it. Reconnaissance photographs showed something far larger being cut into a chalk hill in the Pas de Calais, at a place called Mimoyecques, and nobody was certain what it was. The answer the Allies produced was one of the strangest weapons programs of the entire war. It was called Operation Aphrodite. The idea was to take a worn-out heavy bomber, strip it of guns, armor, and seats, fill it with explosive until it could barely climb, and turn it into a guided missile. A volunteer crew would take off, get the aircraft steady, and hand it over. A second aircraft flying behind it, the mothership, would fly it by radio using a television camera mounted in the nose. Then, the two men still inside the bomb would arm the load, crawl back to an open hatch, and jump into the slipstream with no second chance. The Army Air Forces went first, and it went badly. The first missions flew on August 4, 1944. One aircraft went down before its crew could get out of it. Another spun into the ground. A pilot was killed when his parachute did not open in time at low altitude. Of those early attempts, not one drone struck the target it had been sent against. The men who flew them were volunteers who had been told only that the work was hazardous and secret, and who were not permitted to explain it to anyone. The failures were classified. The losses were quietly absorbed, and the program went on. Nobody outside the program was ever told about it. The Navy believed that it could do the job better. Its version was called Project Anvil, and it would use the Liberator, the same aircraft Kennedy had been flying for the better part of a year. A hand-picked group of men was pulled together under the cover name Special Air Unit 1. On July 31, 1944, that unit moved from Dunxwell up to Royal Air Force Station Firstfield in Norfolk, closer to the North Sea and to France. When the call went out for a volunteer pilot, Kennedy put his name down inside a day. He gave away a confirmed seat on a transport home in order to do it. Firstfield was a station that officially held nothing at all. He would not be flying alone. The second seat went to Lieutenant Wilford John Willey, a Texan, 35 years old, married, with children waiting at home for him. Willey was not a pilot by trade. He was an electronics officer, one of the few men who genuinely understood the arming and control equipment, and he wanted this mission badly enough that he used his seniority to take it. Another officer had been slated for that seat and lost it to him, and would live with that for the rest of his life. Neither man had told his family a word about any of it. Remember Willie's name. Nearly every account of what happens next leaves him out of it, and he had a family too. There was a problem, and men on the ground had already found it. The arming circuit was wired in such a way that a single switch, thrown in the wrong order, could do considerably more than arm the load. The circuit that made the aircraft live could also set it off where it sat. At least one Navy officer working on the equipment raised the danger directly with his superiors and asked to change the wiring. The answer that came back was that the system had been designed by experts and was not to be modified in the field. The men who designed it would not be the men riding on top of it. What happened next is not in the standard record. We are just getting to it. On the morning of August 12, 1944, the aircraft sat at Firstfield with its guns gone, its armor gone, and its bomb bay and fuselage packed solid with Torpex, a British explosive roughly half again as powerful as TNT. How much was aboard is still argued about. The Navy record gives 21,170 pounds. Some accounts say 10 tons, others say 12. Nobody agrees, and every man who loaded those crates by hand is gone now. Loading it took the ground crews the better part of 2 full days. The aircraft carried a new designation for what it had become. It was no longer a patrol bomber at all. On the paperwork, it was a BQ-8. The plan was precise. Kennedy and Willie would take off, climb to 2,000 feet, and hold a straight and level course over the Suffolk coast. Two motherships would take control by radio, while a television camera mounted in the nose showed the controllers on those aircraft what the drone itself was seeing. Once control transferred cleanly, the two men would arm the explosive, walk back through the fuselage, and bail out over friendly ground. The drone would fly on alone across the channel to Mimoyecques. If anything failed during the handover, there was no procedure written for it. Every stage of it depended on equipment nobody had ever used in combat before. They lifted off at 1800 hours. The aircraft was heavy and slow, and it climbed like something that did not want to be in the air at all. Around them, the escort formed up, the two motherships, a weather aircraft, and photographic planes sent along to record whatever was about to happen. It was a clear, bright evening over East Anglia. Below them lay fields, hedgerows, a few thousand English civilians sitting down to their supper, and the flat marsh country running out to the North Sea. The evening was so clear that people on the ground stopped to watch them pass overhead. Kennedy had flown this profile in practice. He had never once flown it armed. At about 1820 hours, the transfer of control was made. Kennedy and Willie moved to arm the load. The safety pin came out of the circuit. Kennedy pressed his transmitter and spoke the agreed code, Spade flush. Those are the last words anyone ever recorded from him. What the words meant was that the weapon was live and the aircraft was now theirs to steer from behind. He and Willie had a few minutes left to reach the hatch and jump. In the aircraft trailing them, men were watching the drone closely, and they saw nothing wrong with it at all. It was a completely ordinary moment. Then the recording stops, and everything after it is reconstruction. Then the sky turned white. The aircraft detonated in one enormous blast at roughly 2,000 feet, about 8 miles southeast of Halesworth, above the woodland near the village of Blythburgh. The explosion was so complete that no meaningful trace of either man was ever recovered from it. A following aircraft was thrown sideways and badly damaged by the shockwave. On the ground, windows blew out across the village, roofs were stripped bare, and fire started in the woods below. Nobody down there had been told a thing about what was flying over their heads that evening. The blast was felt for miles across the Suffolk countryside, and it was over in under a second. Nothing was found. Search parties walked the woods at Blythburgh for days and recovered fragments of the aircraft scattered across a wide stretch of Suffolk farmland. Of Lieutenant Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr. and Lieutenant Wilfred John Willie, there was nothing whatsoever to bury. Both men were declared killed in action, and their families were told only that they had died on a special mission. Both were awarded the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Air Medal. Their names were cut into the tablets of the missing at Cambridge. There was nothing for their mothers to stand beside. One of those two names is famous today. The other one should be. There is a harder fact underneath all of this, and it concerns the target itself. Mimoyecques had already been hit. On July 6, 1944, 5 weeks before Kennedy ever took off, Royal Air Force heavy bombers had put Tallboy bombs into the chalk above the site. The underground construction was wrecked, and the position was effectively abandoned by the Germans who had been building it. They had already walked away from that hill and left it to fill with water. Nobody told the volunteers any of that. The place he died attacking may have been an empty hole in the ground. He was sent against a target the Allies had already taken apart themselves. In Hyannisport, Massachusetts, it was a Sunday afternoon. The family had finished lunch, and the younger children were out on the porch with the radio playing. 2 priests came to the door. Joseph Kennedy Sr. took them into the next room, and when he came back out, he told his children that their brother was dead. Rose Kennedy later wrote that her husband, a man who had spent his whole life arranging outcomes for other people, could arrange nothing at all about this one. 4 years later, she would lose a daughter as well, Kathleen, in a plane crash in France. The son who was going to be president was gone, and there was not even a body to bring home. John Kennedy did the only thing he could think of to do. In 1945, he gathered letters and recollections from family, from classmates, and from the men who had flown alongside his brother, and had them privately printed in a small book called As We Remember Joe. He wrote the opening piece in it himself. A few hundred copies were made and it was never sold in any shop. 16 years later, that younger brother took the oath of office as President of the United States, standing in a place mapped out from the beginning for a man who was not there to take it. That book is the closest thing that exists to a portrait of him in the words of his own circle. The Navy convened a board of review. It examined whether the two pilots had armed the weapon too early and rejected that finding out right, and the decorations stood. Beyond that, no conclusive cause was ever established, and none has been since. The leading suspicion has always rested on the electronics. A television camera fitted into the aircraft is thought to have been inadequately shielded, allowing stray emissions to close a relay and reach a detonator. If that is what killed them, the two men were destroyed by equipment installed to help them. No one was ever held responsible. The men who had warned about the wiring were proved right far too late to matter. So the question sits there, and it has never once been settled. Some would say Joe Kennedy Jr. is exactly what the word courage was made for. He had flown his tour, he had his orders home in his hand, and he climbed into that aircraft anyway because somebody had to and he would not ask another man to do it for him. Others would say exactly the opposite. That he got into 10 tons of explosive to win something inside his own family that could never be won in a cockpit, and that his father's ambition killed him as surely as the wiring did. Both of those readings are held by people who actually knew him. I am not going to tell you which one is right. Tell me below. Lieutenant Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr., United States Naval Reserve, Bombing Squadron 110 and Special Air Unit 1, was killed in action on August 12, 1944 over Blythburgh, Suffolk, England. He was 29 years old. Beside him died Lieutenant Wilfred John Willey of Texas, aged 35, a husband and a father. Neither man has a grave. Their names are cut into the tablets of the missing at Cambridge. On December 15, 1945, the Navy commissioned a destroyer that carries his name, and she is still afloat at Fall River. A like on this video is a small thing, but it puts both of those names in front of a few more people. He has been dead for more than 80 years, and outside of his own family, almost nobody knows how he actually died. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Navy patrol squadrons, the 8th Air Force, or anywhere in the air war over Europe, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.